everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you have never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we're going to be talking about the solved case of Queena Phu, a young woman from Florida. Late one evening in 2008, Queena went out to run a quick errand at her local library, completely unaware that a dangerous sexual predator was lurking nearby. That night, Queena became the victim of an incredibly violent attack which left her fighting for her life, and whilst doctors tried their absolute hardest to save her, the police set out to try and find the sadistic individual responsible for this crime, and fast before they potentially struck again. But quickly before we get into the case, please listen carefully to the following. This video is about the assault of a young woman and it involves heavy themes such as violence towards women, rape, sexual assault, child abuse and animal cruelty, as well as themes such as brain injury resulting in paralysis. Viewer discretion is advised. So for this week's case, we are going back to the spring of 2008 in Bloomingdale, which is an area located in Hillsborough County in the state of Florida in the US. And this is Queena Phu, an 18-year-old girl who lived in Florida with her family. Queena was born on the 22nd of April 1990. Her mother was named Vanna and Queena was one of two siblings. She had an older sister named Anna who was about 3.5 years older than her. I couldn't find the name of Queena's father anywhere. I'm not sure if he was really in the picture because Queena's older sister Anna said that it was always just her, Queena and their mum Vanna growing up. They were like this little trio and they were very, very close as a family, and the family lived in an area within the Tampa Bay area of Florida. Queena was described by her loved ones as being a very nice and kind and smiley person who had such a big heart. She literally had a heart of gold, and as well as that, she was funny and popular. She always had a lot of friends. She was also described as being clumsy and klutzy sometimes, and also dorky. I think she loved school. She was a bookworm, and she was very intelligent and studious, and she would literally get involved in as many clubs and activities as she could in school. By the time this case took place, she was a senior in high school, and she would insert herself into so many extracurriculars. She was very involved in sports clubs like soccer and volleyball. She was apparently in this student government club. There was another club at Queena's high school called Best Buddies, which was basically like a program where students could help out and kind of become friends with some of the other students who had learning disabilities. So of course Queena wanted to do that too. Outside of school, she would spend a lot of her time volunteering at different hospices. She honestly just seemed like such a kind-hearted, generous person. She was always willing to help others. She must have been a very busy young woman too, because as well as juggling school and all of her extracurriculars, she also had a part-time job. Queena worked in retail at an Abercrombie and Fitch store. She absolutely loved fashion. In fact, she decided that that was what she wanted to do career-wise once she had graduated from high school. Queena's plan was to, I believe, study fashion at the University of Florida, and she had already been accepted there on an academic scholarship, so that was something that she was so excited for. But before that was going to happen, there was another event that was occupying much of Queena's mind and headspace, an event that she was really, really looking forward to, and that was her senior prom. And by the time this case occurred, her prom was literally only about a week away, and she already had this beautiful purple dress picked out. She was going to get her hair done and her makeup done and go with her best friend. She literally could not wait. However, towards the end of April in 2008, tragedy struck when 18-year-old Queena Phu became the victim of an incredibly brutal and violent attack, which meant that she never got to attend the prom that she was literally counting down the days for. The date was the 24th of April 2008, and that day Queena had been to school school, and then when school ended, she headed to work. She did a shift at the Abercrombie and Fitch store, and then once she finished her shift that evening, Queena actually planned to go out with some friends because it had been her 18th birthday literally just 2 days before, so they were all going to meet up and celebrate. But before meeting up with her friends, and after leaving work at around 9:45 that night, Queena got into her car and she headed to the local library in Bloomingdale because she had some books that she needed to drop off. Obviously by this time of night the library was closed, but outside of the library there was apparently this like box where people could drop off their books that they were handing back in if the library was shut. So Queena drove to the library car park, and at the same time she was on the phone to one of her best friends, Rachel. And when she arrived, she actually made a comment to Rachel about this guy that she could see also in the library parking lot. She said to Rachel something along the lines of, "I can see this weird looking guy sitting on a bench near the library." And clearly there was something about this guy that made Queena a tad nervous, because she asked Rachel if she could stay on the phone with her while she handed in her books, and obviously Rachel said yes, of course. So Queena proceeded to get out of her vehicle. She opened the back door of her car to grab her book. She was still speaking to Rachel on the phone, but then all of a sudden, just moments after this, Rachel heard the sound of screaming. Queena started screaming on the phone, and then the line just went dead. The phone cut off. So of course Rachel was extremely panicked at this point. Her best friend had just told her that she had seen this weird guy at the library, and then all of a sudden she started screaming. So something had clearly happened to Queena, something bad. So as soon as the phone cut off, Rachel began trying to call Queena back. However, she never got an answer. She was calling and calling and calling, but Queena wasn't picking up the phone. And so Rachel decided to ring one of her and Queena's other friends, Priscilla, because Priscilla actually lived fairly close to the library. So Rachel asked Priscilla on the phone if she could please go to the library right now and check if Queena is okay. And as Priscilla headed there, Rachel also began getting in touch with Queena's family. She rang her mum, Vanna, and told her that something had happened to Queena at the Bloomingdale library. And Vanna immediately called her eldest daughter, Anna, Queena's big sister. And upon hearing this news, everyone just headed directly to the library. Of course, the first person to arrive at the library was Queena's friend Priscilla, because she lived the closest. And when she pulled into the parking lot, she immediately noticed that Queena's car was still there, but Queena was gone. There was no sign of her. But just the car in itself was even more cause for alarm, because it was still on, the engine was still running, and the radio was still on when Priscilla got there. The driver's side door was open, and on the ground right by the car was Queena's mobile phone. The phone that she had been on while she was talking to Rachel just moments before it cut off. And this phone was in pieces on the ground. It was broken in two, and as well as that, there were also what appeared to be spots of blood on the ground by the phone and around the car. So Queena must have been attacked literally just after she got out of her car. There must have been some kind of violent struggle, because how else do you explain the blood and the broken phone? But if she had been attacked, then where was she now? Was she still somewhere near the library, or had she perhaps been kidnapped and taken elsewhere by her attacker? Upon arriving at the library and finding this blood, Priscilla called the emergency services. She called 911, and meanwhile other people started to arrive at the scene. Queena's mother Vanna arrived, I think her friend Rachel arrived, her sister Anna was still on the way. And when they all got there, they literally formed like a search party. They didn't wait for the police. I think they all just split up and they started looking around the area surrounding the library. They were shouting and screaming Queena's name, and it wasn't long before they found her. As Priscilla was looking around an area just behind the library, she spotted Queena lying in a ditch covered in blood, and she wasn't moving. Queena was found, I believe, around 10:50 p.m. that night, which was about 40 minutes or so after Rachel heard her screaming on the phone and the alarm was raised. Queena had very clearly been been subjected to an absolutely horrendous attack. It was clear from her injuries that she had been savagely beaten and just left for dead in this ditch. But by some miracle, despite the extent of her injuries, she was actually still alive when paramedics got to the scene. She was unconscious, but she was alive. She was literally clinging onto life. And so she was quickly taken to the hospital where doctors began trying to save her. And when the police arrived at the library, they of course started looking around for potential evidence, and also they started just trying to piece together what had happened to Queena. Now, they obviously knew from the blood that was around Queena's car and her mobile phone that that was where the attack started. She was approached and attacked literally moments after she got out of her vehicle. But the drops of blood didn't stop there, didn't stop at the car. I believe there was actually a blood trail leading all the way to behind the back of the library, right to the ditch where she was found. And along this blood trail, there were some other pieces of evidence that the police took note of. I believe one of Queena's shoes was found on the ground at some point along this trail. There were also what appeared to be two bloody handprints. There was one handprint in blood on this metal sign in the parking lot and another bloody handprint on the brick wall of the library. And the police believed that these bloody handprints were Queena's, and that this evidence indicated that she must have still been conscious even after being initially attacked by her car. The bloody handprints and her shoe being discarded on the ground suggested that she was probably being dragged behind the library to the ditch with force. She was trying as hard as she possibly could to fight off her attacker. She literally grabbed onto that metal sign in the parking lot to try and prevent them from pulling her away. But sadly, the attacker clearly managed to overpower her. They were strong enough to drag her to that ditch despite her trying to fight them off. Not far from where Queena was found, her backpack was discovered on the ground in the grass, and literally all of her belongings from this backpack were on the ground around it. So perhaps this was also an attempted robbery. The attacker was also trying to steal from Queena, see if she had anything of monetary value in her backpack. And again, there were spots of blood around this area too. An additional piece of evidence that the police collected at the scene was what looked like a kind of homemade shiv. It was a plastic utensil from a Wendy's restaurant that had clearly been filed down into a sharp knife shape. Now, as far as I'm aware, Queena hadn't been stabbed by the attacker, and I don't believe there was any blood on this shiv, so it didn't appear as though the attacker had used it as a weapon that night. But the fact that it was found on the ground at the crime scene did indicate that they had probably dropped it, or it fell out of their pocket during the struggle as they were dragging Queena towards the ditch. And I mean, the fact that they even had this shiv on them that night in the first place indicates that this crime was premeditated. This wasn't a spur of the moment attack. The attacker brought this shiv with them to the library that night because they intended to either attack Queena specifically or attack the first woman that they saw. And it was soon determined that it was probably the latter of the two. It seemed that this was probably a random attack rather than a targeted attack, because when the police spoke to and they took statements from Queena's friends and family, they could not think of a single person who would have wanted to do this to Queena. She had no known enemies. She just wasn't the type to have enemies. Everyone who knew her loved her. There was no one in her life that would have had a motive for wanting her dead. So yeah, as I said, it did appear as though this attack was completely random. Queena was picked at random that night. She was attacked by a stranger and she was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Meanwhile, as detectives began their investigations, doctors were still trying desperately hard to save Queena's life. When she arrived at the hospital, she went into a coma and the doctors really did not know if she would make it. In fact, they believed that it was more than likely that she would not survive. Her injuries were just horrendous. As I mentioned earlier, it was determined that she had been badly beaten by her attacker to the point where her skull was basically smashed. She had skull fractures, which obviously resulted in a traumatic brain injury. In addition to that, her nose was broken. I believe her jaw was shattered or broken too. She had suffered a couple of strokes as a result of her injuries. Her eyes were completely bruised and swollen shut from where she had been hit in the face repeatedly. And it was also determined that the attack had actually left her blind in her eyes, because not only had she been beaten, but she'd also been strangled by the attacker. And this cut off the oxygen to her brain momentarily, which caused the blindness. She was also absolutely covered in insect bites, ant bites from where ants had descended on her while she was in the ditch. And tragically, it was also determined that Queena had been sexually assaulted by her attacker. She had been raped that night. So it appeared as though this attack was sexually motivated. Absolutely horrifying. What Queena went through that night is just unimaginable. I mean, you can't even comprehend the fear and the terror that she must have experienced, or the fear that her family must have felt in the immediate aftermath, not knowing if they were going to lose Queena, if she would ever wake up from her coma, or at least that was until the day following the attack. That afternoon, Queena did wake up, and her family said that when she woke, she was very, very distraught. She was just screaming. She was kind of just trying to fight everyone away. She was probably still in this panic state. Obviously, she couldn't see anything, so I wonder if maybe she thought she was still being attacked because her family and the doctors were touching her and trying to get her to calm down. Although, having said that, when the police tried to speak to Queena after she woke up, she was unable to tell them anything. She couldn't describe her attacker to them because she could not remember the attack. And something that really breaks my heart is that when Queena woke up from her coma, one of the first things that she asked her big sister Anna was if she would still be able to go to the prom, which was just days away by this point. She still desperately wanted to go to the prom, and Anna of course said, yes, don't worry, we will get you there. But sadly, this was a promise that Anna was just unable to keep, because although Queena had woken up from the coma, she was not out of the woods. She just continued to deteriorate. The trauma to her head and her brain was so severe, and scans revealed that her brain would just not stop swelling. The swelling was getting worse and worse, and so doctors were forced to perform brain surgery and then put Queena back into a coma, a medically induced coma, in the hopes that this would give her brain the time that it needed to heal and recover. But it was still not known whether or not she would pull through and survive this. Her life really did hang in the balance. Meanwhile, of course, as all of this was happening at the hospital, the detectives were still working on trying to identify the man that had committed this heinous crime. And as part of their inquiries, they started looking into sex offenders who lived nearby the Bloomingdale Library, because the police had a theory that this was probably not the first offence that the attacker had committed. In fact, it was thought that perhaps Queena's attack was actually linked to another rape case which happened about 10 months before this case occurred. Early in the morning on the 28th of June 2007, a man wearing a ski mask broke into a daycare centre in Bloomingdale, and at the time there was only one person in there, a 62-year-old woman who worked there. She'd gotten there early that morning to open the daycare centre and start preparing breakfast for the kids who were due to come in that day. So she was busy doing all of that when this masked man broke in and he immediately attacked her. He raped this woman at knife point before fleeing the scene. Following this horrific attack, the police were obviously called and inquiries immediately began to try and catch this rapist, but the police were finding it extremely difficult. They released CCTV footage from the daycare centre of the attacker literally breaking into the building that morning, but of course they couldn't see his face because he was wearing a mask, so they just couldn't identify him, and as time went on, the case remained unsolved. And then, like I said, it was 10 months later, in April of 2008, when Queena Phu was attacked and raped, when the police started to make connections. Could the man who raped that woman at the daycare centre have been the same man who raped Queena? Was the offender a serial rapist? So as well as looking into local sex offenders, the police also launched a public appeal. They appealed to the media and the public, asking for anyone with any information regarding Queena's attack or the daycare worker attack to come forward. These cases really were all over the news. Everyone in the area and surrounding areas was aware of what had happened, and it was following these media and TV appeals when the police did receive one particular tip that they believed may have been related to Queena's case. A young high school student from Bloomingdale got in touch with the police, and he said that on the night of the 24th of April 2008, the same night of Queena's attack, he was with his father in the Bloomingdale Library parking lot at around 9:30 p.m. because he, like Queena, was also dropping off some books in the box outside of the library. And he said that whilst he was there dropping off his books, he saw another young man sitting on a bench near the library. Now, if you recall from earlier on in the video, when Queena arrived at the library that night, she said to her friend Rachel on the phone that she saw this, quote, weird-looking guy also sitting on a bench near the library, and he made her feel a little bit anxious. Now, the police had pinpointed the time of Queena's attack as starting around 10:08 p.m, so about 38 minutes after the high school student was there dropping off his book. They were able to establish this through Queena's phone records. They could see from her phone records that her phone call with Rachel ended and the phone went dead at 10:08 p.m, just after Queena started screaming. So when the police received this tip from the high school student, it seemed more than likely that this guy on the bench that the high school student saw at 9:30 that night was the same guy that Queena saw at 10:08 p.m, and that this guy on the bench was probably the attacker. Now, luckily, this high school student actually recognized this guy sitting on the bench. He was even able to give the police his name because it turns out that they went to the same high school together. He identified the guy on the bench as being Kendrick Morris, and he was just 16 years old at the time of this case taking place. And when the police spoke to another witness, a woman who claimed that she was in the library parking lot at 10 p.m. that evening, she said that she also saw Kendrick Morris sitting on the bench. So that put Kendrick Morris at the scene of the crime just minutes before Queena would have pulled into the parking lot and she was attacked. It really was looking like teenager Kendrick Morris may have been the perpetrator. So just for a bit of extra information about Kendrick Morris and his life, I mean, there isn't really too much information about his life online that I could find, apart from the fact that he apparently grew up within a very abusive household. News articles state that his stepfather, his mother's partner, was very, very abusive towards him, both physically and mentally. His stepfather would be violent towards Kendrick, but he would also do things like break his toys if he was ever naughty or if he misbehaved. He would just destroy his toys in front of him. And sources state that his mother never really tried to protect him from this abuse. Who knows, perhaps she herself was also abused by him, and so she didn't feel as though she could do anything, but for whatever reason she never really stepped in and tried to protect her son. So he was very much facing this abuse alone and dealing with it on his own. Apparently he was taken away from his abusive home at one point by authorities, although I don't believe this was a permanent thing. I think he was eventually sent back to live with his mum and his stepfather. And I also read in one article that Kendrick had also been the victim of 2 separate sexual assault incidents in his life too, which as far as I'm aware his parents weren't involved in. I believe it was another person or 2 other people that did this to Kendrick, and it's believed that all of this abuse that he had suffered in his life resulted in him developing anger issues which he could never control. As for a criminal history, when the police looked further into that, they discovered that even at just 16 years old, he did have a criminal record. I believe it was a couple of years before this case took place in 2004, so when he was only about 12 years old, when he was arrested for animal cruelty. He would torture animals, and it's been theorized that the reason he may have done this was because he enjoyed, for once, having the power over another living thing. All throughout his childhood, he never had power or control. It was his stepfather who had control over him, who made him feel completely powerless. So sickeningly, he enjoyed having that power over the animals that he abused. But perhaps he didn't stop at animals. Maybe harming animals eventually got boring for Kendrick Morris. It wasn't exciting enough for him anymore, and so perhaps he decided to step it up, and instead of harming animals, he decided to start harming people, women. Maybe he was the one who attacked Queena Phu. I mean, we know he was seen at the scene of the crime just minutes before the attack. So when the police learned of Kendrick Morris and they learned that he had a history of animal cruelty, he quickly became a suspect in Queena's case. So the police managed to get him down to the police station, and of course they were eager to speak with him regarding the attack on Queena Phu. However, they were unable to because his mother said no. Obviously, he was just 16 years old, he was a minor, and at this point the police didn't have any solid evidence linking him to the crime. They didn't have the grounds to arrest him, so they couldn't hold him, and it was his mother's decision as to whether or not she would allow the police to question her son, and she said no. And so Kendrick left the police station with his mother. But of course the police weren't just done with him. They wanted to see if they would be able to match any of the evidence that had been collected from the crime scene to Kendrick. And luckily, they had a breakthrough. You remember that homemade shiv that was found at the scene, the plastic utensil that had been filed down to a knife shape? Well, scientists discovered a fingerprint on that shiv, and when examined further, it was found that this fingerprint was a match to 16-year-old Kendrick Morris. This was his shiv, so that just further placed him at the scene of the crime that night. And thankfully, as a result of this fingerprint match, the police now had the evidence that they needed to obtain an arrest warrant, and Kendrick Morris was arrested on suspicion of the rape and attack on Queena Phu. And the evidence against Kendrick Morris did not stop there. Following his arrest, further DNA samples were taken from him and compared against the DNA of the attacker that had been collected from Queena's body during a rape kit, and it was found that Kendrick Morris's DNA matched the DNA of the perpetrator, further proving that he was the one who assaulted Queena. And upon learning about this additional evidence, the police were able to piece together what they believed happened to Queena that fateful night. So we know from the witness statements that Kendrick Morris was sitting on a bench outside of the library that evening. Apparently he was a regular visitor of the Bloomingdale Library, and I guess it's not exactly known for definite whether or not this attack was premeditated. Was he sitting on the bench just waiting for a woman to come along that he could attack, or did he just happen to see Queena and decide to attack her in the spur of the moment? Who knows? I mean, to me, the fact that he was carrying a shiv indicates that there was a level of premeditation here. But anyway, he was sitting on that bench outside of the library, and when Queena drove into the parking lot and she began to take the books out of her car whilst also speaking to her friend Rachel on on the phone, Kendrick Morris approached her, probably from behind, and he grabbed her and began trying to drag her towards the back of the library. As we know from evidence at the crime scene, there was a violent struggle between the two. Queena was doing everything that she possibly could to fight for her life and escape Kendrick Morris, but he was able to overpower her, and during the struggle she was obviously sustaining injuries that meant that she was just getting weaker and weaker. Morris beat Queena severely. She was punched and thrown against the wall, she was strangled and sexually assaulted, and then once Kendrick Morris was satisfied, he just left her to die in that ditch. Maybe he even thought that Queena was already dead when he left the scene, who knows. Before leaving, it's believed that he emptied Queena's backpack on the ground near the ditch, maybe in an attempt to make this look like an attempted robbery gone wrong, and then he fled. And the police were able to establish where he actually went afterwards. After walking away from the library, Kendrick Morris put on a coat to hide the blood, Queena's blood, on his clothing, and then sickeningly it was found that he went to a nearby McDonald's restaurant and he ordered 2 Happy Meals, and he just sat down and ate his food as calm as ever. And then after finishing his food, he went to a local Walmart store and he was seen on the store's CCTV just walking around the shop looking at video games. And then following this, they were able to determine that he got into a taxi and he went back home. How disturbing is that? This teenage boy has just raped and nearly beaten and strangled to death an innocent young woman, and yet immediately afterwards he just goes and gets himself some food. He didn't look panicked or scared on the CCTV footage. He didn't look upset or remorseful. He wasn't fazed at all by what he had just done. It was like he did not have a care in the world. And this is a 16-year-old boy, 16 years old. But perhaps the reason he wasn't nervous or panicking after the attack was because this wasn't the first time that he had committed a crime of a similar nature. You see, when the police identified Kendrick Morris as being the man that assaulted Queena, they began to wonder if maybe he had attacked other women before. They wondered if maybe he was the one responsible for the rape of that 62-year-old daycare worker, which happened the year before in June of 2007, which by the time of Queena's attack still remained unsolved. And when Kendrick Morris's DNA sample was entered into the National DNA Database, this theory was ultimately confirmed to be true. It turns out that his DNA was in fact a match to the DNA of the man that broke into the daycare centre and attacked that woman. Kendrick Morris was also the daycare centre rapist that the police had been looking for 10 months before Queena's attack. And Kendrick Morris was obviously even younger when he committed that attack. He was just 15 years old when he sexually assaulted the daycare worker, and so he was charged in relation to both cases. He was charged with the rape of the daycare worker and with the rape and the attack on Queena Phu. But before we get into his court proceedings, let me fill you guys in on Queena's health and her recovery during this time. So as I mentioned, due to the swelling on her brain, Queena had to undergo brain surgery and be put into a medically induced coma in the hopes that this would give her brain the time that it needed to heal from the trauma. And when she came out of the coma a couple of weeks later, the doctors just did not know if she would ever wake up. It really was like a flip of a coin chance. So of course her family were just always waiting at her bedside, praying that she would eventually wake up and that she would pull through. And thankfully, by some miracle, she did pull through and she did eventually wake up. However, her life was never going to be the same as before. The brain injury meant that she was unable to really do anything for herself anymore, ever. She could no longer talk or eat or drink for herself. She pretty much lost motor function and she couldn't walk. She was going to have all of these disabilities for the rest of her life now because of what Kendrick Morris did to her. She was going to have 20 24-hour care and assistance because the attack had left her paralysed. However, despite all of this, her family say that Queena still understands things. She can't talk anymore, but she can hear people and she reacts to things. She can laugh and she can have a giggle, and her family are just so happy and so relieved that they at least have that. You know, there was a time where it was looking more than likely that Queena would not survive this, that she would die as a result of her injuries. So they were just so grateful that she was still with them, regardless of her disabilities now and the challenges that lay ahead. But back to Kendrick Morris's court proceedings. So he went to trial separately for both cases. So he had two trials, one for the daycare rape case and one for Queena's case. And I believe he went to trial for the daycare rape case first. He entered a plea of not guilty. However, he was ultimately convicted of the rape of the 62-year-old daycare worker. And when he went to trial for Queena's attack, he did the same thing again. He pleaded not guilty, but thankfully, once again, the jury were able to see through his lies and he was convicted. He was found guilty of every single one of his charges, including sexual battery, kidnapping with the intent to commit a felony, and aggravated battery causing great bodily harm. And for his crimes, he received a sentence of 65 years in prison. However, nearly a decade after the attack on Queena in 2017, Kendrick Morris's sentence actually changed, apparently due to some changes and adjustments to federal and state laws in relation to juveniles being sentenced for major crimes. From what I can gather, these developments in the law basically meant that Kendrick Morris was able to request a resentencing hearing due to the fact that he was a minor when he committed his crimes. He was able to request a new sentence, obviously in the hopes that the judge would reduce his current 65-year sentence. And ultimately, his sentence was changed from 65 years to just life in prison. According to sources, he is due to have another sentencing review in 2031 and he may come up for parole. But given just how sadistic and violent his crimes were, it is very likely that he will just spend the rest of his life behind bars. But as for Queena, today in 2023, it's obviously been about 15 years since she was attacked. So she is 33 years old now. And by the looks of things, she is doing really well. Of course, she still requires around-the-clock care. She still lives with her mother, Vanna, and Vanna takes care of her full-time. Queena is wheelchair-bound and she still can't really speak or eat for herself or anything. But as I mentioned earlier, she still understands people and can hear people, and she kind of communicates with her facial expressions now. Her family have said that whilst her body might be still, her mind is very much alive. They say that Queena loves to make people laugh and smile, and she gets really excited when people mention going to shopping malls and music concerts, so she can still enjoy doing many of the things that she loved doing before the attack. And something that really made me emotional whilst I was researching this case is that in 2017, at 26 years old, Queena was finally able to fulfill her pretty much lifelong dream of going to the prom. Of course, because of the attack, she was unable to attend her senior prom, which took place just the week after she was nearly killed. And as we know, it was something that she was so looking forward to, and she just couldn't go until 2017, because that was when a good friend of Queena's named Derek asked Queena if she would do him the honour of being his date to his high school senior prom. Derek and Queena had been friends for about 3 years by this point. They met after Derek's mother started providing aromatherapy treatments to Queena, and they became very close. So Derek could think of no one else that he would have rather gone to the prom with. And the way that he asked Queena is just absolutely adorable. He made this little sign which read, "Queena, prom would be unbearable without you."
So I got you a little teddy bear. It's pink, because I know you like pink. I said, "Queena, prom would be unbearable without you."
Oh, that's so cute.
I don't know if I'm supposed to get on my knees.
No, you're not supposed to get on your knees.
Married. Queena, you trying to be my daughter?
prom. How cute. Hold your sign up.
Hold the sign up.
Oh, I love your bear.
And Queena was ecstatic with this promposal. I have a quote here from her sister Anna, and she said, Queena was grinning from ear to ear and beaming. She does not speak and cannot see much, but you could tell by the expressions on her face that she was thrilled. And Queena and Derek went to the prom on the 8th of April 2017. And Queena actually wore the same beautiful purple dress that she had picked out and had intended to wear for her original senior prom in 2008. The dress was altered slightly, and yeah, she was finally able to wear it and she looked absolutely beautiful, which is a really sweet note to end on. As heartbreaking and tragic as Queena's story is, how lovely is it that she finally got to attend prom? Might have been nearly a decade late, but she finally got to have that magical night. And that concludes this case. That is the case of Queena Phu. I just want to mention before I go that Queena's family have set up a website called Join Queena, where you can basically learn more about Queena's journey and what she's getting up to now. You can purchase her mother Vanna's book through their website. Vanna wrote a book about her daughter's attack called The Life She Once Knew, and you can also make a donation through their website, which will go towards helping to pay for Queena's care. So I will leave a link to their donation page and the website down below in the description box if you would like to check it out and make a contribution. But yeah, that is it for this case. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on the case in the comments. Also let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. I would really love to start doing some more survivor stories like this, so if you have any survivor story case requests, then let me know in the comments, or alternatively I do have a case request form linked in the description box. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie. Bye.